Beverly Hills is the kind of place where nightmares feel out of place. The streets are manicured, the houses lined with palm trees, and the nights glow with the quiet hum of money. It's the world of curated perfection, where people drive Teslas and smile through perfectly arranged lives. But behind closed doors, even here, darkness can take root. In 2021, that darkness found a home in the mind of a young man named Quinn Berkett, a 24-year-old from Beverly Hills who would become the face of a crime so cold, so surreal, that it stunned federal investigators. On the surface, Scott's life seemed ordinary. He came from a comfortable background, educated, quiet, the kind of young man who blended into the background of privilege. But inside that quietness lived a storm: isolation, resentment, and a deep hunger for control disguised as affection. Friends would later describe him as intelligent but detached, someone who struggled to connect, who wanted love but couldn't understand how to hold it. He spent most of his time online, gaming, coding, drifting through digital spaces where emotion could be filtered through screens. It was there, somewhere in that borderless world of social media and dating apps, that he met her, a woman from across the country whose life intersected his by chance. She wasn't famous, not wealthy, not part of his social circle. She was a real person, kind, open, and searching for connection, the way so many do in the digital age. They began messaging, long conversations that stretched into the night. In the beginning, it was sweet. He seemed attentive, charming in a reserved kind of way. They bonded over shared interests: art, music, films. And for a brief moment, it looked like the start of something genuine. But beneath Scott's polite messages and compliments, there was something brittle. He wanted more time, more assurance, more submission. His texts grew more demanding, his tone sharper whenever she didn't reply immediately. At first, she brushed it off as intensity, a kind of overeagerness. It wasn't until she visited Los Angeles in October 2020 that she realized how far off her perception had been. She had flown in to see him, to meet the man she had spent months talking to. The plan was simple: a few days together, get to know each other, see if their connection was real. But what she found in person wasn't the version of Scott she knew from her phone. He was colder, controlling, and, as she later described to investigators, sexually aggressive. The man she met in Beverly Hills was not romantic. He was possessive. The trip, which should have been a spark, became a warning. She left disturbed, feeling uneasy, her instincts telling her to run. When she returned home, she began to pull away. She told him the connection wasn't right, that she didn't want to continue. Scott didn't take it well. Messages turned into arguments, arguments into pleas, and pleas into accusations. She blocked his number, then unblocked it after he begged, hoping to end things peacefully. But peace wasn't what Scott wanted. He wanted control. And when she finally cut him off completely, something in him broke. In his mind, rejection was humiliation. He began replaying every message, every word, every moment of their short time together, twisting it into evidence that she had wronged him. He convinced himself she had used him, embarrassed him, made him feel powerless. And to a man who had built his identity around the illusion of control, that was unbearable. In the months that followed, Scott's obsession festered. He scrolled through her social media, searching for signs of her life without him. He resented her happiness, her silence. He wanted her to feel what he felt: powerless. But where most people's anger fades, his grew sharper, colder, more methodical. By early 2021, he was spending hours on the dark web, the unindexed underworld of the internet, where anonymity promises freedom from consequence. It's a place where anything seems possible, where drugs, weapons, and even human lives are offered in exchange for cryptocurrency. For Scott, it became a digital mirror for his darkest thoughts. He didn't stumble onto the idea of murder overnight. He spiraled into it, convinced by anger and arrogance that he could orchestrate it and never be caught. Through anonymous forums and encrypted platforms, he began searching for hitmen. He typed phrases into search bars that most people wouldn't dare think: hire killer Bitcoin, darknet hitman, discrete elimination service. What he didn't realize was that many of those sites were scams, digital traps that take money from fools who believe they can make murder invisible. But not all of them were fake. and one of them would lead him straight into the arms of federal investigators. In April 2021, Scott found a site that looked convincing: professional language, detailed services, clear pricing in Bitcoin. The site promised anonymity, discretion, and success. It claimed to have operatives worldwide. Scott sent his first message, a short inquiry about having a woman removed. He described her in vague terms at first: a nuisance, a person who had caused him emotional distress. But within days, the details became disturbingly clear. He named her. He gave her city. He sent photos. He described her daily routine, where she worked, how she lived alone. The tone of his messages was calm, almost businesslike, as if he were negotiating a transaction instead of planning a murder. The payment was set at approximately $13,000 in Bitcoin, a price he transferred through a wallet he believed was untraceable, but he didn't know it yet. But every keystroke, every transaction, was already under watch. The site he was using was being monitored by law enforcement. And one of the people on the other end of his messages wasn't a killer. It was an undercover federal agent. Still, Scott carried on, confident in his anonymity. He wrote that he wanted the killing to look like an accident, maybe a car crash or a robbery gone wrong. He didn't want suspicion pointing back to him. He wanted her erased quietly, surgically, without a trace. When the undercover operative asked for confirmation of the target, Scott provided it without hesitation. When they requested proof that he was serious, he sent more Bitcoin. When they asked if he wanted proof of completion, he said yes. He wanted photos of her body once the job was done. There was no rage in his words anymore, just precision. A man who had turned human life into a line item on a digital ledger. In Beverly Hills, life went on as usual. Neighbors saw him coming and going from his apartment complex, polite, reserved, keeping to himself. No one imagined that behind that calm exterior was a man waiting for confirmation of a murder he believed he had just bought. The weeks ticked by. He checked his encrypted messages obsessively, refreshing for updates. Each time he saw the words "job accepted," his pulse raced. He believed it was done, that somewhere, someone was hunting the woman who had rejected him. But what he didn't know was that the hunt was already reversed. Law enforcement had built a file, every message cataloged, every Bitcoin transaction traced. The moment he paid, the countdown to his arrest had already begun. He thought the dark web would be a refuge, a place where messy feelings could be cleaned up with clean transactions. To Scott Berkett, it offered promise, anonymity, pay-and-forget solutions, a world where consequences came wrapped in encryption and disappeared into blockchains. When the initial shock of rejection wore off, the practical question haunted him: how to make her absence permanent without entangling himself. The answer, he convinced himself, was hidden pages and private wallets. First it was research, hours spent in forums where anonymous users traded horror stories and success tales, where syntax and slang replaced the moral vocabulary of everyday life. He learned how to set up a cryptocurrency wallet. He taught himself to use Tor and to copy and paste PGP keys into message boxes that looked like nothing more than code. The arcane language made him feel clever. Each new phrase learned tightened the illusion that he'd created a private life beyond the reach of any witness. He found the murder-for-hire site the same way people find everything on the dark web: by following threads and reputation. The site wasn't flashy. It looked almost deliberately amateurish, a catalog of services with blunt terms and a price list. But that was part of the appeal. It read like a business. It promised discretion. It promised results. Under its contact form, it asked for the usual: target name, location, proof of identity, and, crucially, proof of funds. Scott filled those fields with the clinical calm of a customer checking out online. When an account was created, the other end responded almost immediately. The language was efficient: we operate on escrow. Send 0.5 BTC as deposit. Provide confirmation of target identity. The agent on the other end, a username with no profile picture and a PGP key, asked practical questions. Asked whether the death should look like something else, whether it should be fast or messy. Scott answered the way someone arranges home services: specify the details, choose the method, confirm the price. The first transfer was the hardest. He watched a progress bar move in a world where progress felt like a step deeper into madness. The number he agreed to, roughly $13,000 in Bitcoin, represented, to him, a price of erasure. He rationalized it. If he paid, the problem would simply be solved. He told himself he'd be free to grieve and rebuild. He might have imagined private redemption in a world where systems finished what human wills began, but things rarely work like that, and the dark web rarely hides true secrecy from those who know how to look. What Scott didn't know was that law enforcement agencies had been sharpening their expertise on these platforms for years. Teams embedded in cybercrime squads monitored forums, sniffed wallets, and traced the on-ramps where fiat currency became cryptocurrency. The same technology Scott used to mask himself became breadcrumbs for investigators skilled at following blockchain trails and correlating them with the pattern of human behavior. After his deposit, the tone of the messages changed. He was asked for verification of the victim's identity. He sent photos, a short bio, and later, when asked for confirmation that he was serious, he sent more. He asked the operative to make it look like an accident, to orchestrate an ending that would be written off as misfortune, a robbery gone wrong, a drunk driver's fatal mistake. He requested proof afterwards. He wanted photos to be sure the job had been done. The act of asking for proof revealed a relationship to violence that was transactional and distanced. Other people's hands doing what he had imagined doing, but never could on the other end of the line. The person Scott believed to be a hired killer was actually a federal undercover agent. The agent played the part, calm, professional, for weeks, building credibility and collecting the record that would become the spine of the prosecution. The sting was surgical. Let him talk, let him pay, and let him prove his intent with the clear gestures of action and money. The more he proved himself, the less plausible any later claim that it had all been a joke, that he was meticulous in the worst way. He discussed timelines, feasibility, and contingencies. He asked about the operatives' methods, whether they used vehicles with temporary plates, whether they removed camera footage, whether they left the scene to look plausible. He wanted assurance that no connection would loop back to him. The agent answered in marketplace speak, "We make it tidy," and kept a paper trail. There were moments when he seemed to falter. A late-night message that read like a confession, "Is this really me?" was met with the transactional answer he wanted to hear. "Yes, we can handle it." Those were the times he felt most powerful, not when someone agreed to love him, but when someone agreed to erase the rejection entirely. He even tried to control the narrative of the aftermath, requesting staged evidence that could be passed later to family or friends as proof that the death was not murder but misfortune. That request, that he wanted the world to accept a manufactured truth, reinforced the ugly logic at his core. The goal was not merely to remove the person. It was to control the story about why she disappeared. The thought of her absence being explained by chance rather than malice soothed his need for anonymity and absolution. Waiting became an obsession. He checked the messages constantly, his phone tethered to a bag of nervous energy. Each notification made the world tilt toward resolution. Every time the undercover replied, he read it as confirmation that the plan was in motion. He began to imagine life afterward, already rehearsing apologies he would never have to make because he had decided he wouldn't have to. There were small slips that hinted at an unraveling mind. He started to believe in the mythology he created, comparing himself to characters who'd take control in old noir films, to figures who enforced their own moral code. The fantasy required a villain to be excised from his story. The woman, in his mind, had been elevated from a person to an impediment to his narrative arc when the FBI and allied cybercrime units decided to move. The arrest plan was careful. Agents had all they needed: messages, transaction records, and the online account's metadata. They could demonstrate intent beyond a reasonable doubt. The ledger on the blockchain showed transfers. The PGP-signed messages showed identity. The undercover recordings captured promises. It was a modern conspiracy, built from zeros and ones and human cruelty, that in the weeks before his arrest, Scott began to change in ways that people in his orbit noticed only in hindsight. He grew thinner, more remote. He canceled plans, stopped answering friends' calls, and when he did speak, it was in a tone of brittle certainty. He even made a comment once about being done with loving and ready to start over, a line friends interpreted as breakup drama, not premeditated homicide. The moment of the arrest was dispiritingly mundane. A knock at the door, a flurry of badges, and the clack of handcuffs. As agents read him his rights, The man who had tried to turn death into an order on a screen seemed bewildered for a second, as though the law arriving at his apartment was the plot twist he'd forgotten to write for himself. When he was let out, neighbors watched with a mixture of curiosity and repulsion. The glitter of Beverly Hills' manicured life did not seem to prepare them for the sight of someone they'd waved to. Now wearing the label of a would-be killer, the digital case moved quickly from arrest to indictment. The prosecution's brief relied on the raw trail Scott had left, the communications with the undercover agent posing as a hitman, the Bitcoin transfers, the explicitness of the requests, and the proof of completion demand. The government would later explain in court that this was not merely an internet fling gone wrong, but a fully formed plan to murder, every component deliberate, every transfer traceable. In the weeks leading to plea negotiations, there were spare attempts at explanation. Defense counsel argued that Scott was not a hardened criminal. He was a desperate man who made bad decisions while emotionally unhinged. They emphasized his youth, his lack of prior violent offenses, and tried to cast the transaction as the act of someone who had lost perspective, not the plan of a calculated killer. The jury of public opinion, however, had already begun to convict him in whispers and headlines. The victim, meanwhile, had to live in a new, strange reality. The woman who had flown to meet him and then fled now found her life marked by a shadow no amount of moving or locks could remove. She was advised to change routines, to increase security, to take the kind of precautions you read about in crime prevention pamphlets, but never imagine needing. For her, the betrayal wasn't only emotional. It was existential. She had been reduced to a dossier, an image in a chat window, and then targeted. The knowledge that someone she'd known had so casually sought to buy her death was a wound that did not heal with time. When Scott eventually pleaded guilty, it was the culmination of that digital paper trail. On the courthouse steps, the narrative the prosecution had built was clear to anyone who wanted to look at the facts. A man who used the technology of the age to attempt the unthinkable, assuming the murk of the internet could hide his intent. He received his sentence, 5 years, a term shorter than the statutory maximum, but long enough to remove him from the life he'd tried to ruin. What lingered, though, was not the length of the sentence, but the method. The case was a vignette of a new criminal landscape. Crime arranged through anonymous networks, lives transacted in cryptocurrency, and the chilling banality of a man who clicked send on a plan to end another human life. It was a cautionary tale about the illusion of internet anonymity and the peril of turning private rage into a public scheme. In the months after the verdict, the community tried to stitch itself back together. Friends wondered how they had missed the signs. Tech communities debated how to better police the dark corners. Victims groups used the case to underscore that rejection can metastasize into danger and that anyone can be a target when someone else views them as an obstacle. The woman, whose days were now measured by new routines and discreet security measures, tried to reclaim the life that had been interrupted by his choices. She spoke rarely in public, preferring instead the slow work of rebuilding, therapy, relocation, small acts that accustomed her to a world where safety was not assumed. And Scott, behind bars, had time enough to confront the hollow fantasy he'd lived. The glossy sense of control that had animated his online persona eroded in the face of confinement. The digital bravado that sent wires across blockchains tasted hollow when reduced to metal bars and counted hours. He had traded his freedom for a short-lived illusion of power, a ledger entry, a message thread, a transaction that could not be reversed. The lesson, painfully obvious afterward, was human and technological at once. The internet can extend and magnify the darkest parts of the heart, and modern anonymity can make moral boundaries appear negotiable. But it could not erase the law or the human cost. The trail Scott left behind, so confident in its invisibility at the start, became the chain that led him straight into the arms of an authorities who had learned to read blockchain like blood in the water. By the time federal agents walked Scott Berkett into the courthouse, the story had already been written in the public mind. The Beverly Hills man who tried to buy a murder on the dark web. Reporters called it a crime of privilege, a digital obsession, and most hauntingly, proof that even love can be coded into violence. He wore a simple gray jumpsuit, his hands cuffed, his posture small against the tall doors of the federal building. Outside, The California morning was bright, indifferent. Inside, his world had collapsed into schedules, hearings, and sterile walls that in the beginning, he denied nothing. The evidence was too solid to dance around. He had confessed in the only way that mattered, through his actions. The Bitcoin transfers, the conversations, the requests for proof. His defense team knew that fighting the evidence would only drag him deeper. So the strategy became mitigation, a desperate attempt to make the court see a human being behind the monster the headlines had created. They wanted the narrative to shift from deliberate evil to emotional breakdown. They painted a portrait of a young man overwhelmed by heartbreak, mentally fragile, someone who lost control after a brief but intense relationship. But the prosecution's evidence stripped that story bare. They laid out the timeline in chilling clarity. The online relationship that began innocently. The meeting in Los Angeles. The woman's attempt to cut ties after his aggression. His obsession after rejection, and then the long, calculated descent into the digital underworld. They read excerpts of his messages with the undercover agent. His request that the murder look like an accident. His confirmation of the victim's photos. His demand for proof of death. There was no heat of the moment rage here. Only cold premeditation. Prosecutors displayed printouts of the Bitcoin wallet transfers. $13,000 worth of cryptocurrency sent across a digital pipeline, recorded forever on the blockchain that he thought made him invisible. Agents explained how each transaction, though encrypted, had been traced through exchanges, leading right back to his real identity. The courtroom audience listened in stunned silence as investigators explained how Berkett had messaged the supposed hitman multiple times, checking progress, asking, "Is the job underway?" Then came the words that made the courtroom gasp, his chilling note to the agent. "I want to make sure it looks random. Nothing that connects back to me. Send proof once it's done." It was read aloud by the prosecutor in a monotone voice that somehow made it more horrifying. The woman he had targeted sat in the back, surrounded by two victim advocates and a federal marshal. She didn't look at him. Her hands trembled slightly when the messages were read, but she stayed still. To her, this wasn't just a trial. It was confirmation of how close she had come to disappearing from the world without anyone knowing why. She had met him through a simple online chat in 2020. She had been cautious but open, thinking she was meeting a quiet, respectful man. When she flew to Los Angeles to meet him, she had stayed in his apartment for a few days before realizing something was off. His temper, his possessiveness, the way he spoke about control. She had left quickly, shaken, and afterward, she tried to let him down gently. But he didn't hear the word no as rejection. He heard it as defiance. When the FBI showed her the messages months later, her own photos sent to an alleged hitman, her life described in detail by a man she had once shared coffee with, she broke down completely. In her victim impact statement, she wrote, "I live every day knowing that someone I met online wanted to buy my death, like a product. I wake up checking locks, checking windows, even though I know he's in custody. The fear doesn't go away." Her statement was read in court the day before sentencing. The room was silent except for the sound of paper turning and her voice trembling on the recording. Scott kept his head down. Whether it was shame or calculation, no one could tell. The investigators who had tracked him spoke next. They detailed the digital footprint, how Berkett had navigated Tor, how he had used VPNs, and how those protections had been unraveled through his own carelessness. He'd logged in from a home network once, sent an unencrypted message that included his own phraseology used elsewhere online. Technology, they explained, didn't hide humanity. It only magnified the mistakes. Every step of the plan that he believed was invisible had, in fact, been illuminated by his own fingerprints. One agent testified. He believed he was purchasing privacy. What he bought instead was a trail that led straight back to him. The prosecution emphasized the deliberate nature of the act. This was not a man who lost control in a moment of anger. The prosecutor said, this was a man who researched, planned, and paid for the murder of another human being because he could not accept rejection. They displayed his online search terms, his wallet addresses, and the escrow conversation where he confirmed payment when it was the defense's turn. Scott's attorney spoke softly. "He's 24, he said, with no prior criminal record. He made a choice out of desperation, out of emotional collapse, not out of malice. He believed the dark web was a fantasy world where nothing was real. He now knows it's not. The attorney asked the judge to consider his client's youth and the possibility of rehabilitation. The judge listened, expression neutral. Then he looked at Scott and asked if he wished to speak. For the first time in the entire proceeding, Scott lifted his head. His eyes were tired, his voice barely audible. "I can't explain what I did," he said. "I was lost. I wasn't thinking straight. I wish I could take it back." There was no drama, no tears. Just a statement stripped of emotion, which, if anything, made it sound rehearsed. The judge nodded slowly. He spoke about the gravity of the crime, about how technology doesn't absolve morality. "You thought the internet would make your choices invisible," he said. "But what it did was make them permanent." He mentioned the terror the victim lived with, the deliberate nature of the plan, and the symbolic weight of what Berkett had done, not just an attempted murder, but a warning about how modern detachment could turn deadly. When the sentence was read, 5 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release, there was a rustle of movement in the gallery. Some were relieved. Others thought it was too light. But the judge had chosen balance, punishment, and the possibility of redemption. Though no one seemed sure whether redemption was still within Berkett's grasp, he was led away. He turned once, not toward the victim, but toward the public seats. For a second, it looked as though he wanted to see whether anyone still believed he was more than the crime. Then he disappeared through the side door, swallowed by the machinery of the justice system. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered again. Microphones flashed. One asked the prosecutor whether justice had been done. "Justice," she said, "is that she's alive. Everything else is a lesson for the rest of us." In the days that followed, the internet that had once been his weapon turned against him. His name became a cautionary tale in cybersecurity blogs and dating forums. "The Beverly Hills Bitcoin hitman," one headline read. Reddit threads dissected the psychology behind the crime, some expressing pity, others disgust. On YouTube, armchair detectives uploaded explainers about the dark web, citing Berkett's case as proof that you can't hide from digital footprints. The woman he targeted never returned to her old social accounts. She moved, changed jobs, changed names on some platforms. Her life became quieter, smaller, but safer. The FBI gave her victim protection guidance, and she took it seriously. To her, the case wasn't just an internet story. It was proof of how thin the line between affection and obsession can be when amplified by technology. As for Scott, prison stripped away the illusions of control that had driven him. The silence of his cell replaced the hum of servers and the glow of screens. The anonymity he once coveted became isolation. Letters sent to him from family went unanswered. He had once lived online. Now he lived in a space where the internet didn't exist. Years later, when journalists revisited the case for documentaries and podcasts, it was often framed as a modern parable, a man who tried to outsource murder to a marketplace of ghosts, and in doing so, destroyed his own life. The story spoke to the age, love found online, rejection processed through screens, and violence executed through digital transaction. It wasn't passion that led him there. It was entitlement mixed with access, the illusion that technology could make consequences optional. The woman, in her one public statement afterward, wrote simply, "He used the internet to try to erase me. But the internet also saved me." They found him because nothing online is truly hidden. When the doors of the Los Angeles federal courthouse closed behind him, the world Scott Berkett knew ceased to exist. The soft glow of Beverly Hills streetlights, the quiet luxury of his parents' home, the screen-lit comfort of his digital world, all of it vanished into the flat echo of a prison hallway. The clang of the cell door was his first new sound of permanence. He had spent months believing that anonymity could make him untouchable, that hiding behind encrypted messages and Bitcoin wallets would keep his crimes contained in fantasy. But now, he was visible again, stripped of identity. Reduced to a number, a man whose attempt to erase another human being had led to the erasure of his own freedom. Federal prison life doesn't accommodate illusions. Days were measured in count times, in trays of food that tasted of salt and repetition, in the shuffle of bodies moving through schedules without meaning. At 24, Scott found himself surrounded by men twice his age, some hardened by violence, others dulled by time. They didn't see him as special, not as the Beverly Hills programmer or the Bitcoin genius the media described. To them, He was just another story of a man who thought he could outsmart consequences and failed that in his first months inside. He barely spoke. He kept his eyes on the floor, his head down, his voice silent. The other inmates nicknamed him Ghost, not for his past with the dark web, but because he moved like someone already halfway gone. He took whatever job was given, mopping hallways, folding sheets, wiping tables. The motions kept him from thinking too long about the world outside, about the woman whose name he had tried to erase from existence, and the faces of the agents who had read his messages out loud in court like eulogies for his sanity. Letters came at first, his parents, a cousin, a few old friends who didn't know what to say but wrote anyway. They told him they still believed in him, that 5 years wasn't forever, that he could rebuild when he got out. He never responded. The shame was too thick, the words too hollow. In his cell, he filled notebooks with calculations, old coding logic, half-finished algorithms, scattered reflections about anonymity and guilt. Sometimes, when the noise of the cell block got too loud, he pressed his palms against his ears and replayed the judge's words. You thought the internet would make your choices invisible, but what it did was make them permanent. Those words haunted him because they were true. He had spent his life believing that the digital world was different from the physical, that what was typed could be deleted, what was sent could be erased, what was paid could be hidden. But now, every moment of his crime existed as data, as evidence, as unchangeable lines of code that told the story of his failure. Months turned into a year, and something began to shift. He started reading again, not the technical manuals he'd once devoured, but philosophy, psychology, even theology. In the quiet of confinement, he looked for meaning in the same way he'd once looked for loopholes. He read about obsession and ego, about how love could warp into possession when filtered through insecurity. He began to see his own story in the pages, how his need for control had disguised itself as affection, how his loneliness had metastasized into rage. He realized that what he'd wanted wasn't her death. It was her submission, her acknowledgement, her surrender to the idea that he mattered. When she refused, he had decided to force her silence in the only way he knew how. In therapy sessions offered by the Bureau of Prisons, he was cautious at first. He avoided direct answers, deflecting with phrases like bad decisions and emotional instability. But the counselor pressed him to name things for what they were, to say murder, control, revenge. The first time he said them aloud, his voice cracked. It wasn't repentance yet, but it was the beginning of understanding. Meanwhile, outside prison walls, his story continued to circulate. True crime podcasts retold his case, complete with dramatic narration about the Beverly Hills Bitcoin hitman. YouTube channels used his mugshot as thumbnails. His name became shorthand for the intersection of technology and depravity, a cautionary tale about how easy it was for someone with money, Wi-Fi, and a wounded ego to weaponize the internet. Federal investigators used his case in training presentations, showing how cryptocurrency and the dark web could no longer guarantee anonymity. He had become both a headline and a warning label. The woman he had targeted tried to live quietly. She moved twice, changed her number, deleted social media. But the trauma lingered. In interviews years later, she described the strange duality of being a victim of a crime that almost happened. "I'm alive," she said, "but I live like someone who died once already." She checked her windows every night, avoided meeting people online, and still froze whenever she saw a car parked too long near her house. The knowledge that someone had put a price on her head, $13,000 paid in Bitcoin, never left her. It wasn't the threat itself that haunted her anymore. It was the idea that it came from someone she'd once trusted enough to meet in person. Scott's release date grew closer. By then, he was quieter, leaner, and slower to react. He had served nearly 4 years with good behavior. He had earned small privileges, library access, a tutoring role for inmates studying computer basics. The irony was thick. The man who once weaponized the internet now taught others how to type. In the library, he often sat by himself after classes ended, staring at screens that could no longer connect to the outside world. He said little, but other inmates noticed that he flinched when people joked about getting even with exes. "Not worth it," he'd mutter. "You don't come back from that." When his release came, the world had changed. Cryptocurrency had evolved. The dark web had new names. and the people who had once whispered about his case had moved on to news stories. He stepped out into sunlight for the first time in years, carrying a single bag of possessions and the weight of his own history. The probation officer who greeted him handed him a phone, a basic model with no browser access, no apps, no social media. His internet use would be monitored for the next 3 years. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had once used the internet to try to control someone else's life. Now the internet would control his. That he moved back to Los Angeles, though not to Beverly Hills. He lived in a small apartment funded by his parents. He worked at a repair shop under a different name, assembling electronics, keeping his head down. He didn't speak publicly, never gave interviews, never defended himself. If he saw headlines about his past, he turned away. If people recognized him, he ignored it. The world didn't forget him entirely. His name lingered in search results, embedded forever in archives and articles. Every time someone searched dark web hitman Bitcoin, his case appeared as a cautionary tale. For law enforcement, it became a case study in digital forensics. For the media, it became content. For the victim, it remained a nightmare. For Scott Berkett, it was a lifetime sentence of memory. Privately, he wrote, not letters, not code, but confessions, long, handwritten pages where he tried to dissect the mind of the man he had been. It wasn't love, one entry read. It was ego. I thought I could make her stay by removing her choice. The truth is, I couldn't stand being ordinary. I wanted control so badly that I forgot what it means to be human. Those words were never published. They existed only in the notebooks found in his apartment years later, when he moved away quietly after his probation ended. Neighbors said he kept to himself, polite but distant. Some suspected who he was. Others didn't. But one neighbor recalled seeing him one morning sitting on his porch, holding a newspaper, his expression blank as he read an article about another man arrested for a murder-for-hire plot arranged online. He looked like someone reading his own obituary, she said. The irony of his story never faded. He had used the technology of a new century to act out one of the oldest human impulses, revenge. He had sought control through circuitry, punishment through anonymity, power through pixels.